So, the series finale of Loki finally premiered on Disney+. And with that in mind, I think it's only proper for me to give my full opinions on Season 1 of Loki. And if we're being honest, I didn't really like this season that much. I don't think that it was the worst thing out there, but I just didn't really have anything that was attracting me to this season. I don't think it was necessarily bad, but again, there wasn't anything hooking me at the beginning, which made the later stuff especially troubling for me to watch. So I guess let's do a full breakdown with more or less pros and cons of what I did and didn't like about this season. And since I've already said that I didn't really like that much about this season, I think maybe we should start a bit more positive and talk about what I did like about this season. And that is especially the main performances. I feel like all of the actors and actresses are doing a really good job in their roles, and there are a few super inventive scenes in this show that I think are really cool concepts. And overall, the time variance authority is a really cool idea to morph into some sort of TV show like this show was trying to do. And also, I think some of the relationships were made in a very good way. The original relationship between Loki and Mobius is really cool, and it's kind of fun to watch them grow together as characters. And then as well, I think that the relationship between Loki and Sylvie is also a really cool relationship, although in some ways it's kinda ruined in the end, but not really. It's hard to explain without getting into spoilers, because I don't really feel like getting into spoilers in this review. But overall, I don't think that their relationship was awful by any means, but I do think that there were a lot of ways that they could have improved it. With that in mind, those are the main things that I liked about this season. And there are a lot of things that I didn't like about this season, so let's get into those next. I think one of my biggest problems with this season is the lighting. It's not apparent at all by looking at the trailers, but there are a lot of scenes in this show that are just completely dark and you can barely tell what is going on. And I am not a fan of this at all. Looking at the trailers, you can tell that they had very well lit scenes, so it's confusing as to why they didn't make every scene well lit so that you can actually tell what's going on. Also, I feel like this show's use of color isn't as fun and inventive as I would have hoped. I mean, most of the color that you're going to see is just kind of black and more of a yellowish white, and then occasionally orange. And that's about all for the majority of the season. And this is just a color scheme that just kind of gets old pretty fast. Most of the sci-fi type Marvel films usually have a large variety in the color that they use, which make them a lot more fun to look at. And that wasn't really the case with this show. It kind of uses the same color palette all throughout, and this just didn't work for me. But as well, one of my biggest problems with this show is the lack of characters. As I talked about earlier, I really liked the relationships in this season, but there's also not a lot of relationships going on. And that's because this show mostly just has three main characters: Mobius, Loki, and Sylvie. Which is fine, but these characters don't really have enough going on with them. And also the pacing of this show, and this is probably my biggest problem with the show overall, the pacing is not good in this show. It is distractingly bad sometimes. And this is just because of how slow everything goes. I feel like if each episode of this show was in between 35 and 40 minutes, it would have gotten the same point across and probably would have been a lot better. There is a lot of exposition that feels like stuff that we already know and shouldn't be repeated, but they keep telling us about it. In fact, basically the final episode is pretty much 40 minutes of just exposition. I'm not making that up either. And this is a problem because there's just not a lot of action. There's not a lot of stuff that's drawing me to enjoy this season overall. I'm sure that the next season is probably going to be better of this show because they're probably going to focus on what the exposition has been telling us from this season, but it makes this season really, I guess you could say, bad in comparison. But overall, that is my pros and cons list for Loki. I don't think that this show is like the worst thing ever, but I will say that it is undoubtedly the worst MCU show to come out so far. I just felt like there should have been more going on and more to get me to enjoy this season, but that didn't really exist. And while there were some things that I liked in it, it just doesn't save this one for me. And while I do feel a bit guilty giving this show such a low score, I just, at the end of the day, feel that this is the score that it deserves, and that is a 4 out of 10.